3 months had passed since the Jenkins children had come to live with Margaret, and their temporary emergency placement was approaching its official review date. Margaret had successfully completed all the required foster care training, passed her background checks, and received glowing reports from the children's therapists and teachers. What she hadn't expected was the phone call that came on a Tuesday morning in February, while she was helping David with his breakfast and reminding Emma about her science project presentation. "Margaret, this is Mrs. Patterson. I have some news that I'd like to discuss with you. Could you come in this afternoon while the children are at school?" Margaret's stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. Over the months, she had almost allowed herself to forget that this arrangement was meant to be temporary, that somewhere out there, social workers were still looking for a real family to adopt the Jenkins children. She had begun to think of herself as their real family, and the possibility that they might be taken away felt like facing another devastating loss. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice calm for David's sake. "Everything is fine. Actually, the news is good. But it's complex, and I'd rather discuss it in person." Margaret spent the rest of the morning distracted and worried, going through the motions of her daily routine while her mind raced through possibilities. Had they found relatives for the children? Had someone else applied to adopt all 3 siblings? Had Margaret made some mistake that would disqualify her as their caregiver? When she arrived at Riverside that afternoon, Mrs. Patterson was waiting with Linda Rodriguez and Sarah, all of them wearing the careful expressions that Margaret had learned meant important decisions were being discussed. They gathered in the same conference room where Margaret had first heard that the emergency placement had been approved. "Margaret," Mrs. Patterson began, "first, I want you to know that your foster care certification has been completed and approved. The children's progress under your care has been remarkable, and everyone involved agrees that you've provided exactly the kind of stability and love they needed." Margaret felt her shoulders relax slightly, but she sensed there was more to come. "Thank you. That means everything to me." Linda Rodriguez leaned forward with a smile. "The reason we asked you here is that we've received an application for the permanent adoption of all 3 Jenkins children." Margaret's heart stopped. This was what she had been dreading, the moment when someone else would step forward to claim the children she had come to love as her own. She tried to prepare herself to be gracious, to put the children's needs ahead of her own heartbreak. "The application," Mrs. Patterson continued, "came from you." Margaret blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" 3 weeks ago, you submitted a formal application to adopt Emma, Mason, and David Jenkins," Linda explained gently. "Don't you remember?" Margaret's mind raced back to the stack of paperwork she had been filling out as part of her foster certification process. There had been so many forms, so many questions about her intentions and long-term plans. She had answered everything honestly, including the question about whether she would be interested in permanent placement if it became an option. Yes, I filled out the forms. But I thought that was just part of the foster care paperwork. I didn't realize it was an actual adoption application." Sarah laughed softly. "Margaret, when you check the box that says I am interested in adopting these children permanently, and you fill out 40 pages of supporting documentation, that's an adoption application." And Mrs. Patterson added with a smile that was genuinely warm, "It's been approved. The state has determined that you would be an ideal permanent placement for the Jenkins children. The question now is whether you actually want to move forward with adoption, or whether you'd prefer to continue with long-term foster care." Margaret felt like the room was spinning. "You're saying I can adopt them? All 3 of them? Legally, permanently?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Linda confirmed. "Emma, Mason, and David would become your children in every legal sense. You would be their mother, not just their foster mother, and they would be your family permanently." Margaret started crying before she could stop herself. For months, she had been living with the constant fear that this happiness was temporary, that someday she would have to say goodbye to these children who had become her heart. The idea that she could keep them, that she could be their forever family, felt too good to be true. "Are you sure they want this?" Margaret asked through her tears. "Have you talked to them about it?" "That's actually something we need to discuss," Mrs. Patterson said carefully. The children are old enough to have input into this decision. Emma, especially, at 14, has the right to express her preferences about permanent placement. We'd like to have a family meeting where we talk through what adoption would mean for all of you. Margaret wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. When? How about tomorrow afternoon? We can meet here, and you can all discuss what this would mean for your family. As Margaret drove home from the meeting, she felt like she was floating between disbelief and overwhelming joy. The children she loved could actually be hers forever. There would be no more reviews, no more social worker visits, no more fear that someone would decide she wasn't the right fit for their family. That evening at dinner, Margaret tried to act normally while her mind raced with how to approach the subject with Emma, Mason, and David. She didn't want to pressure them or make them feel obligated to want something just because she wanted it desperately. How was everyone's day? Margaret asked, the same question she asked every evening as they shared their meal around the dining room table that had become the center of their family life. Emma brightened immediately. I got an A on my science project presentation. Mrs. Johnson said my display about plant growth was one of the best she'd seen this year. That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of your hard work. Mason bounced in her seat with excitement. And I finished reading the entire Harry Potter series. Can we go to the library this weekend to find more books like that? Of course we can, Margaret said, smiling at Mason's enthusiasm. Even after months of unlimited access to books, Mason still approached reading with the joy of someone who remembered when books were scarce. David, who had become much more talkative as he settled into their family, carefully cut his chicken into small pieces before speaking. I helped Tommy at recess today when he fell down and scraped his knee. I told him that when you get hurt, you need someone to sit with you until it stops hurting so much. Margaret's heart swelled with pride at David's compassion. That was very kind of you, David. I'm sure Tommy felt much better having a good friend like you take care of him. As they cleaned up after dinner, Margaret found herself studying the children's faces, trying to imagine what they might think about adoption. Did they want to be legally her children, or were they comfortable with their current arrangement? Did they understand what adoption would mean, or would it feel like pressure to commit to something they weren't ready for? After the children had finished their homework and were settled in the living room for their evening quiet time, Margaret decided to approach the subject carefully. I had an interesting meeting today at Riverside, she began, sitting down on the couch between Emma and Mason while David worked on a puzzle on the floor nearby. Emma immediately looked concerned. Are we in trouble? Did we do something wrong? No, sweetheart, nothing like that. Actually, they had some news that I wanted to share with you and get your thoughts about. Margaret took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. They told me that if we wanted to, our family could become permanent. Instead of foster care, I could officially adopt all three of you. You would legally be my children, and I would legally be your mother. The silence that followed was profound. Emma stared at Margaret with wide eyes, Mason's mouth fell open, and David looked up from his puzzle with intense concentration. You mean forever? Mason whispered. Like, you'd really be our mom forever, and we'd really be your kids forever? That's exactly what I mean, Margaret said gently. But it's not something I would do unless all three of you wanted it too. This is a decision we need to make together, as a family. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but Margaret couldn't tell if they were happy tears or worried tears. Would we still be the Jenkins children, or would we become something else? Your last name would change to Chen, like mine, if you wanted it to, Margaret explained. The first week at Margaret's house was a delicate dance of learning to live together while grieving separately. Emma appointed herself the family's chief worrier, constantly asking if Margaret was sure she wanted them there, if they were being too much trouble, if Margaret might change her mind and send them back to the children's center. Mason fluctuated between periods of almost normal childhood behavior and sudden episodes of crying for her grandmother. David remained mostly silent, but he began following Margaret around the house like a small shadow, never more than a few feet away from her presence. Margaret found herself learning the rhythms of childhood on the fly. She discovered that Emma was a light sleeper who checked on her siblings multiple times each night, and that Mason needed exactly 3 bedtime stories and a song before she could settle down to sleep. David's nightmares came like clockwork at 2 in the morning, and Margaret learned to recognize the soft whimpering that preceded his terrified calls for Grammy. On their 4th night together, Margaret was awakened by David's cries from across the hall. She had been keeping her bedroom door open so she could hear the children if they needed her, and the sound of David's distress cut through her sleep like a knife. She hurried to his room to find him sitting up in the bottom bunk, clutching Elliot and calling out for his grandmother in a voice broken by sleep and sorrow. "David," Margaret said softly, approaching slowly so she wouldn't startle him further. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. You're at home with me." David's eyes were open but unfocused, caught in that terrible place between sleep and waking where nightmares felt more real than reality. "Grammy? Where's Grammy?" "She was making pancakes, and then she wasn't there, and I can't find her." Margaret's heart clenched. She knelt beside the bunk bed, close enough to offer comfort but not so close that she invaded David's space without permission. "David, it's Mama Margaret. You're in your new room, in your safe bed. Grammy can't come back, but you're not alone. Emma and Mason are right here, and I'm right here." David's breathing was rapid and shallow, the kind of panicked breathing that came with reliving trauma in dreams. Margaret had experienced her own share of nightmares after Robert's death, nights when she woke up expecting to find him beside her and had to remember all over again that he was gone. "Can you feel Elliot?" Margaret asked gently. "He's right there in your arms. Elliot is real, and your bed is real, and you're safe." David's grip on the stuffed elephant tightened, and his breathing began to slow slightly. "Elliot's scared too," he whispered. "I bet he is," Margaret agreed. "It's scary to have bad dreams about people we miss. Do you want to tell me about your dream, or would you rather we just sit here for a while?" David considered this seriously. "Grammy was making pancakes, but when I went to the kitchen, she wasn't there. The pancakes were burning, and I couldn't turn off the stove, and I kept calling for her but she didn't answer." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This child was replaying the trauma of finding his grandmother unresponsive, his 6-year-old mind trying to process an event that would challenge even adult understanding. "That sounds really scary," Margaret said quietly. "Dreams about people we've lost can feel so real that it's hard to remember they're just dreams." "Is Grammy really never coming back?" David asked, his voice very small. Margaret knew that this was one of those crucial moments in a child's healing, when the truth had to be told with both honesty and gentleness. "No, sweetheart. Grammy can't come back. When people die, their bodies stop working, and they can't be with us anymore the way they used to be. But all the love she had for you is still real, and all your love for her is still real too." David was quiet for a long time, processing this confirmation of what he already knew but hadn't wanted to believe. "Will you die too?" he finally asked. "Someday I will," Margaret said honestly. "But not for a very long time, and not for many, many years. I'm healthy and strong, and I plan to be here to take care of you for as long as you need me." "Promise?" Margaret knew she couldn't promise something as uncertain as the length of her own life, but she could promise her intention. "I promise I will do everything I can to stay healthy and safe so I can be here with you and Emma and Mason. I promise I won't leave you on purpose." David considered this, then scooted over slightly in his bed. "Will you sit with me until I fall asleep again?" Margaret settled carefully on the edge of the small bed, close enough that David could feel her presence without being overwhelmed. "Of course. Do you want me to sing, or tell a story, or just sit quietly?" Quietly, David whispered. "But can you keep your hand where I can touch it?" Margaret placed her hand on the blanket where David could reach it if he needed to. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep, but Margaret stayed where she was, watching over this brave little boy who was learning to trust again despite every reason to protect his heart. When she finally crept back to her own room, Margaret found Emma standing in the hallway, concern etched on her face. "Is David okay?" "I heard him crying. He had a nightmare, but he's sleeping peacefully now," Margaret whispered. "Have you been having trouble sleeping too?" Emma shrugged, which Margaret had learned was her way of admitting to problems without wanting to be a burden. Sometimes I wake up and forget where I am. And sometimes I have dreams about Grammy too. Would you like to talk about it? Emma looked uncertain, as if she hadn't expected an adult to offer to listen without trying to immediately fix or minimize her problems. Sometimes I dream that we're back in Grammy's house, and everything is normal again. Those dreams are almost worse than the scary ones, because waking up hurts more. Margaret understood this completely. She had experienced the same cruel kindness of dreams that returned Robert to her, only to force her to lose him again each morning. Those dreams where everything is okay again can be really hard to wake up from. Do you think it's bad that sometimes I wish I could stay asleep forever so I could keep seeing her? The question was asked with such quiet pain that Margaret felt her heart break a little more for this young girl who was carrying burdens too heavy for her age. No, sweetheart. That's not bad at all. That's love. You miss Grammy so much that your heart wants to find any way possible to be with her again, even in dreams. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I keep thinking that if I had been a better granddaughter, if I had helped more around the house, if I had noticed she wasn't feeling well, maybe she wouldn't have died. Margaret guided Emma to sit on the top stair, where they could talk without waking Mason or David. Emma, listen to me very carefully. Grammy's death was not your fault. She didn't die because you weren't good enough or helpful enough. Sometimes people's bodies just stop working, no matter how much they're loved or how well they're cared for. But I should have known something was wrong. I'm the oldest. I'm supposed to take care of everyone. You're 14 years old, Margaret said firmly. You're supposed to be learning about the world and figuring out who you want to become. You're not supposed to be responsible for adults or for preventing tragedies that are beyond anyone's control. Emma leaned against Margaret's shoulder, a gesture of trust that still surprised Margaret with its preciousness. I don't know how to stop feeling responsible for everything that goes wrong. It takes practice, Margaret said, thinking of her own struggles with guilt after Robert's death. And it helps to have people around you who remind you that some things are just too big for any one person to control. They sat together in the quiet hallway for a while, Margaret's arm around Emma while the girl cried softly for her grandmother and for the childhood that had ended too abruptly. When Emma's tears finally subsided, she looked up at Margaret with red-rimmed eyes. Mama Margaret? Will you really let us stay here even if we have more bad nights like this? Emma, I will let you stay here especially because you have bad nights like this. Grief isn't something you do politely in private. It's messy and unpredictable and sometimes it wakes up the whole house. That doesn't make you unwanted. That makes you human. The next morning brought new challenges. Mason woke up with a fever, and Margaret found herself calling in sick to work while she figured out how to care for a sick child. She had no experience with children's medicines or knowing when a fever was serious enough to warrant a doctor's visit. Emma, ever helpful and worried, provided detailed information about Mason's medical history and usual responses to illness. Grammy always gave her lots of fluids and let her rest in the big chair in the living room where she could watch TV, Emma explained as Margaret took Mason's temperature for the third time. And she made this special soup with rice and chicken broth that Mason could keep down even when she felt really sick. Margaret found herself grateful for Emma's knowledge, even as she worried about how much this 14-year-old had been required to know about caring for her younger siblings. Can you teach me how to make Grammy's soup? Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from her. Really? You want to learn Grammy's recipe? I want to learn everything that helped you three feel safe and loved, Margaret said. All of Grammy's recipes and songs and traditions that made you feel like family. They spent the day in the kitchen, with Emma teaching Margaret the careful process of making Grammy's healing soup while Mason dozed on the living room couch and David helped by bringing pillows and checking on his sister's temperature. Margaret found herself charmed by the way the children naturally took care of each other, how they had developed systems and routines for managing the difficulties of life without adult guidance. As they cooked, Emma shared stories about their life with Grammy, painting a picture of a woman who had raised 3 children on limited resources but unlimited love. Margaret learned that Grammy had taught Emma to cook and clean not as burden, but as life skills that would serve her well. She had encouraged Mason's love of reading by walking to the library every week, even when her arthritis made walking painful. She had patiently worked with David on learning to tie his shoes and ride a bike, never rushing him or making him feel inadequate for needing extra time. "She sounds like an amazing woman," Margaret said as they stirred the soup together. "She was," Emma said simply. "She used to say that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a decision you made every day to put someone else's well-being as important as your own." Margaret paused in her stirring, struck by the wisdom of a woman she had never met. "That's beautiful. And it sounds like she made that decision for you three every single day." "She did," Emma agreed. "And I think you're making that same decision for us now." When Mason was feeling better the next day, Margaret suggested they visit Grammy's grave together. The children had not been back to the cemetery since the funeral, and Margaret sensed they needed the opportunity to say goodbye in their own way, in their own time. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful, with tall oak trees providing shade over the neat rows of headstones. Margaret hung back as the three siblings approached their grandmother's grave, giving them space to have their private moments of remembrance and grief. Emma knelt first, placing a drawing she had made of their family on the headstone. Mason put down a small bouquet of flowers they had picked from Margaret's garden. David stood very still for a long time, then carefully placed Elliot on the grave. "Elliot wants to visit Grammy," he said quietly, the first full sentence he had spoken since saying Margaret's name the first day. "I think Grammy would love to meet Elliot," Margaret said gently. David nodded seriously, then picked up the stuffed elephant again. "He told her we're okay now. He told her about Mama Margaret and our new house and how we're still together." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, David slipped his hand into Margaret's and looked up at her with those serious dark eyes. "Mama Margaret? Are we a real family now?" Margaret knelt down so she could look at him directly. "What do you think makes a family real, David?" David considered this with the gravity he brought to all important questions. "I think real families take care of each other when they're sick, and they don't leave each other behind, and they remember the people who loved them before." "Then, yes," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think we're a very real family." That evening, as Margaret tucked each child into bed, she marveled at how much their lives had changed in just 1 week. The house that had been too quiet was now filled with the sounds of childhood, homework discussions and bedtime negotiations and the soft whisper of children talking to each other across their shared rooms. As she turned off the lights and headed toward her own bedroom, Margaret heard David call out softly from his bunk bed. "Mama Margaret?" "Yes, sweetheart? I love you." Margaret's breath caught. It was the first time any of the children had said those words to her, and hearing them from David, who spoke so rarely and chose his words so carefully, felt like receiving the most precious gift imaginable. "I love you too, David," she whispered back. "I love all three of you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "Good," David said with satisfaction. "Elliot loves you too. He told me." As Margaret finally settled into her own bed that night, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a lonely widow counting down empty days. Tonight, she was a mother to 3 children who had chosen to trust her with their broken hearts and fragile hope for the future. She thought about Robert, wondering what he would think of the family she was building in the house they had shared. Somehow, she felt his approval in the settled peace that had replaced the restless grief that had consumed her for 3 years. This wasn't the family she and Robert had dreamed of, but it was the family that had found her when she needed it most, and she was grateful for the unexpected paths that love could take. The home visit was scheduled for 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, giving Margaret exactly 3 days to transform her quiet widow's house into a place where children could live and heal. She had never moved with such purpose in her life, not even when she and Robert had bought the house and spent weeks painting and arranging furniture in preparation for the family they had hoped to build together. Margaret started with the guest room, which still contained Robert's desk and filing cabinets from when he had worked from home during his final illness. She spent Wednesday evening carefully packing away his papers and business files, keeping only the photographs and a few personal items that made her smile. The desk went into storage, replaced by a twin bed she purchased that same day. She painted one wall a soft yellow, thinking of Mason's sunny personality, and arranged the books she had bought for children along a low bookshelf. Thursday morning, she tackled the larger bedroom across the hall, the one that had been intended as a nursery when she and Robert still believed children might be possible. It had been a storage room for years, filled with Christmas decorations and old furniture. Margaret cleared everything out, painted the walls a calming blue-green, and set up bunk beds she had found at a second-hand store. The bottom bunk could be David's safe space, she thought, somewhere he could retreat when the world felt too overwhelming. The top bunk would give Emma a place that felt more grown-up, more private. As she worked, Margaret found herself imagining the children in these spaces. She could picture Emma sitting at the window seat, drawing in her sketchpad while keeping watch over her siblings. She could see Mason curled up with a book in the sunny corner where Margaret had placed a comfortable reading chair. And David, she hoped, might find peace in the small alcove where she had built a little fort of pillows and blankets, a place where a traumatized 6-year-old could feel completely safe. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Margaret's nervous energy. She had cleaned the house thoroughly, stocked the pantry with foods children might like, and hidden away anything that might seem inappropriate for young people. She had even bought a coffee maker that would work on a timer, remembering Emma mentioning that their grandmother had always made coffee first thing in the morning. At 1:30, Margaret stood in her living room, looking around at the house that had been her and Robert's sanctuary for so many years. It looked different now, ready for laughter and questions and the beautiful chaos that children brought to quiet spaces. She touched Robert's photograph on the mantel, the same one she had talked to every day since his death. "I hope you think this is right," she whispered. "I hope you'd be proud of what I'm trying to do." The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. Margaret opened it to find Mrs. Patterson accompanied by a woman she didn't recognize, both of them carrying clipboards and wearing the serious expressions that social workers wore when they were evaluating someone's fitness to care for vulnerable children. "Miss Chen, this is Linda Rodriguez from the emergency placement team. She'll be conducting the formal assessment today." Linda Rodriguez was younger than Mrs. Patterson, with kind eyes and an efficient manner that reminded Margaret of the nurses who had cared for Robert during his final stay in the hospital. "Thank you for opening your home to this evaluation, Ms. Chen. I understand you're interested in providing emergency foster care for the Jenkins siblings. Please, call me Margaret." And, yes, I am. For the next 2 hours, Linda Rodriguez examined every inch of Margaret's house with the thoroughness of someone whose decisions could affect children's lives. She checked smoke detectors and cabinet locks, asked about Margaret's work schedule and support systems, and inquired about her experience with trauma and grief. "You've made remarkable changes to your home in just 3 days," Linda observed as they stood in the newly configured children's bedrooms. "This level of preparation suggests you've given serious thought to what these children might need." "I've been volunteering at Riverside for over a year," Margaret explained. "I've seen how important stability and routine are for children who have experienced loss. I wanted them to walk into a space that felt intentional, not improvised." Linda made notes on her clipboard. "Tell me about your own experience with grief. How do you think your loss might affect your ability to help these children process theirs?" It was the question Margaret had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. "When my husband died, I thought my life was over too. I spent almost a year barely getting out of bed, convinced that the best parts of my life were behind me. It was volunteering with children that showed me there are different ways to love people, different ways to be needed and useful in the world." "And how do you think the children will respond to living with someone who has also experienced significant loss?" Margaret considered this carefully. "I think it might help them feel less alone. Not because I'll try to equate my experience with theirs, but because I understand that grief isn't something you get over, it's something you learn to carry. I know what it feels like when people try to rush you through sadness or fix your pain instead of just sitting with you while you work through it." Linda nodded approvingly. "What concerns do you have about taking on this responsibility?" "I'm terrified I'll make mistakes," Margaret admitted. "I've never been a parent, never raised children through trauma. I'm worried David might never speak again, or that Emma will burn herself out trying to take care of everyone, or that Mason might stop believing in the goodness of adults. I'm worried they'll have nightmares I can't comfort away, or that they'll need more help than I can provide." "Those are very realistic concerns," Linda said. What makes you think you can handle them despite these fears? Margaret walked to the window that overlooked her backyard, where she had already called a contractor about installing a swing set. Because I love them already, she said simply. I know that sounds impossible after knowing them for only 3 days, but it's true. Something about their courage in the face of impossible loss, the way they protect each other, the way they've somehow managed to trust me despite having every reason to be suspicious of adults who make promises, they've awakened something in me that I thought died with Robert. When the formal assessment was complete, Linda asked Margaret to sit down at her kitchen table while she filled out the final portions of her report. I have to ask one more difficult question, Margaret. Are you doing this for them, or for yourself? Margaret had known this question was coming, but it still made her pause. Both, she said finally. I'm doing it for them because they deserve to stay together and be loved by someone who sees their worth. But I'm also doing it for myself, because they've reminded me that my life isn't over, that I still have something important to offer the world. If that makes me an imperfect candidate, then I guess I'm an imperfect candidate. Linda smiled for the first time during the visit. Actually, that makes you honest. The social workers who worry me are the ones who claim they're making purely altruistic decisions. Children need to matter to their caregivers, not just be charity projects. At 4 o'clock, Margaret found herself sitting in Riverside's conference room with Linda Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson, Sarah, and the center's director, waiting to hear whether 3 children would be allowed to come home with her. The Jenkins siblings were in the blue room, probably wondering if they were about to be separated despite all the promises that people were working to keep them together. The emergency placement has been approved, Linda announced without preamble. Margaret, you've been cleared for temporary foster care pending completion of the full certification process. The children can come home with you tonight if they're ready. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of relief. Really? All 3 of them? All 3 of them, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. Though I want to be clear about what this means. This is temporary emergency placement while we continue looking for permanent solutions. The goal is still to find these children a long-term adoptive family. I understand, Margaret said, though privately she was already hoping she might become that permanent solution. How do we tell them? Sarah smiled. I think you should tell them yourself. They've been asking about you all day. Margaret walked to the blue room with her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see the 3 siblings exactly as she had left them the day before, huddled together on the couch with Emma reading aloud while Mason and David listened. David still clutched Elliot, but he was sitting up straighter, more engaged with his sister's activity. When Margaret knocked and entered, all 3 children looked up with hopeful, anxious faces. Emma set down her book immediately, searching Margaret's expression for news about their future. Hi, Margaret said, suddenly nervous about the magnitude of what she was about to offer. I have something to ask you 3, and I want you to know you can say no if it doesn't feel right. Emma's hands clenched into fists. What kind of something? I was wondering if you'd like to come stay at my house while the social workers keep looking for your permanent family. All 3 of you, together, for as long as it takes. The silence that followed was profound. Mason's mouth fell open. Emma stared at Margaret as if she couldn't quite process what she had heard. David's grip on Elliot loosened for the first time in days. You mean it? Emma whispered. All of us? Together? I mean it. I have bedrooms ready for you, and there's a big backyard, and a kitchen where we can make pancakes on Sunday mornings if you'd like that. Mason started crying, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. You really want us? Even though we're sad and scared and David doesn't talk? Especially because you're sad and scared, Margaret said, kneeling down in front of the couch so she could look at all 3 children directly. I want you because you love each other enough to be brave when you don't feel brave. I want you because you've been through something terrible and you're still kinda strangers. I want you because my house has been too quiet for too long, and I think we might be able to help each other feel less alone. Emma was crying now too, the careful composure she had maintained for days finally cracking open. When can we go? Can we go tonight? If you want to, we can go tonight. We can pack up Elliot and your books and anything else that's important to you, and you can see your new rooms, and we can order pizza and figure out what our life together might look like." David suddenly stood up from the couch, walked directly to Margaret, and climbed into her lap. He buried his face against her shoulder, still holding Elliot, and, for the first time since she had known him, his small body completely relaxed. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, feeling the trust he was offering her like a precious gift. "Margaret," David whispered against her neck, so quietly she almost missed it. Margaret's breath caught. "Yes, sweetheart?" David pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes serious and intent. "Are you going to be our mama now?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Emma and Mason stared at Margaret, waiting for an answer that would determine whether they dared to hope for something more than just temporary safety. "I'm going to take care of you for as long as you need me to," Margaret said carefully, not wanting to make promises about permanence that weren't hers to make. "And I'm going to love you like you're my own children, because in my heart, that's what you are." David nodded solemnly, as if this answer satisfied some deep need for clarity. Then, he leaned against her again, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of completion she had never experienced even in her happiest moments with Robert. "Can we call you Mama, Margaret?" Mason asked tentatively. "Grammy used to let us call our neighbor Miss Betty Aunt Betty because she was like family even though she wasn't related to us." "You can call me whatever feels right to you," Margaret said, though the word mama made her throat tight with emotion she hadn't expected. They packed the children's few belongings quickly, Emma carefully wrapping her art supplies while Mason gathered the books she had been given, and David made sure Elliot was safely secured in his arms. As they prepared to leave Riverside, Margaret signed papers and received instructions about therapy appointments and school enrollment and the dozen other details involved in suddenly becoming responsible for 3 children. When they finally walked out to Margaret's car, David slipped his free hand into hers without being asked. Emma carried her art supplies like precious cargo, and Mason skipped beside them, chattering nervously about what their new bedrooms might look like. As Margaret buckled David into his car seat and helped Emma and Mason with their seatbelts, she realized she was crossing a threshold she had never expected to approach. 3 days ago, she had been a lonely widow volunteering to fill empty hours. Tonight, she was bringing 3 children home to a house that was about to become something entirely new. "Are you excited to see your new rooms?" Margaret asked as they drove through the early evening darkness toward home. "Yes," Emma said from the back seat. "But, mostly I'm excited that we're still together." "Me too," Mason agreed. "And I'm excited about the pancakes. Grammy made the best pancakes, but she told me the secret is just love and patience." David, who was sitting directly behind Margaret, leaned forward and whispered, "Mama Margaret?" Margaret's heart skipped. "Yes, David? Thank you for wanting us." As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, she looked at the house where she and Robert had lived and loved and grieved, and saw it transformed by the prospect of new life and new love. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't imagine, but tonight, 3 children who had lost everything were about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected families were exactly what broken hearts needed to begin healing. The moment they walked through the front door would change all of their lives forever, but none of them knew that yet. They only knew that for the first time in days, they were walking toward something that felt like hope. Margaret arrived at Riverside Children's Services the next morning carrying a canvas bag filled with items she had gathered from her house. She had spent the evening going through closets and drawers, collecting things that might bring comfort to the Jenkins children. There were books, a soft throw blanket, some art supplies, and a small stuffed elephant that had been a gift from Robert years ago, one of the few child-related items they had kept despite never having children of their own. Sarah met her at the front desk with a concerned expression. "I'm glad you're here early. We had a difficult night with the children. David had nightmares and woke up crying for his grandmother several times. Emma barely slept because she was worried about him, and Mason is running a slight fever. I think the stress is affecting their immune systems." Margaret felt her stomach clench with worry. "Where are they now?" "Still in the blue room. Emma is reading to the other 2, but they all look exhausted. The night staff said David did speak during one of his nightmares, but it was just calling out for Grammy over and over." As they walked toward the blue room, Margaret could hear Emma's voice through the door, soft and soothing as she read from what sounded like a children's book. When Margaret knocked and entered, she found the three siblings exactly as Sarah had described them. Emma sat in the middle of the couch with Mason curled against her side and David leaning against her other shoulder. All three looked pale and worn, their eyes carrying the hollow exhaustion that comes from grief without rest. "Margaret!" Mason's face brightened immediately, and she sat up straighter. "You came back." "Of course I did," Margaret said, settling into her chair from the day before. "I brought some things I thought you might like." She began pulling items from her bag, watching their reactions carefully. The first thing she produced was a collection of colored pencils and sketch pads. Emma's eyes lit up with genuine interest for the first time since Margaret had met her. "I love drawing," Emma admitted. "Grammy got me a set of charcoal pencils for my birthday last month, but they're back at the house and we don't know when we can get our things." "These are yours to keep," Margaret said, handing Emma the art supplies. "Sometimes drawing helps when words aren't enough." Next, she pulled out a book of poetry for young people, which she offered to Mason. "I thought you might like this. Your sister mentioned yesterday that your grandmother loved reading to you." Mason accepted the book with careful hands, running her fingers over the cover illustration. "Grammy had the most beautiful voice when she read stories. She did different voices for all the characters, and she never got tired of reading the same book over and over if we asked." Finally, Margaret reached into her bag and withdrew the small stuffed elephant. It was gray and soft from years of gentle handling, with kind button eyes and a slightly crooked smile embroidered on its face. She had debated about bringing it, knowing that toys could sometimes seem childish to children who had been forced to grow up too quickly. But something about David's stillness had made her think he might need something soft to hold. "This is Elliot," she said, addressing David directly. "He's been keeping me company for a long time, but I think he might be ready for a new friend." David's eyes fixed on the elephant with an intensity that surprised Margaret. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took Elliot from her hands. He held the stuffed animal against his chest, and, for the first time since Margaret had met him, David's rigid posture relaxed slightly. "Elliot is a good name," Mason said approvingly. "He looks wise, like he knows important secrets." David nodded solemnly, as if confirming Mason's assessment of Elliot's character. He didn't speak, but his arms tightened protectively around the stuffed elephant. Margaret spent the morning with the children, watching Emma sketch the view from the window while Mason read poems aloud in a voice that carried echoes of her grandmother's storytelling gift. David remained quiet, but he stayed close to Margaret's chair, Elliot clutched securely in his arms. Around mid-morning, Sarah appeared in the doorway with a woman Margaret didn't recognize. She was tall and professional-looking, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression that Margaret had learned usually meant difficult news was coming. "Children," Sarah said gently, "this is Mrs. Patterson from Family Services. She needs to talk with you about some important things." Emma immediately tensed, setting down her colored pencils and positioning herself protectively between her siblings and the newcomer. "What kind of important things?" Mrs. Patterson smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been working on finding you a place to live while we continue looking for permanent family placement. I have some good news and some challenging news." Margaret felt her stomach drop. In her experience, when social workers started conversations this way, the challenging news usually outweighed the good news by a significant margin. "The good news is that we found a family willing to take in two of you temporarily," Mrs. Patterson continued. "The Hendersons are lovely people with experience fostering children, and they have space for Emma and Mason." "What about David?" Emma demanded immediately, her voice sharp with fear. Mrs. Patterson's pause was answer enough, but she continued anyway. "The challenging part is that the Hendersons aren't equipped to handle a younger child, especially one dealing with trauma-related muteness. We're still looking for a placement for David, but it may take some time." "No." Emma's voice was fierce and final. "We're not being separated. David needs us, especially now. You can't split us up." Emma, I understand how you feel, Mrs. Patterson said in the patient tone adults used when they were about to override a child's wishes, but sometimes temporary separation is necessary to ensure everyone's needs are met. David requires specialized care that I can take care of him, Emma interrupted, standing up and moving closer to David, who had gone rigid again, his arms clutching Elliot so tightly his knuckles were white. I've been taking care of him his whole life. I know what he needs. Margaret watched David's face as the adults discussed his future as if he weren't in the room. His eyes had that hollow look again, the one that said he was retreating back inside himself where the world couldn't hurt him. This child had already lost his parents and his grandmother, and now strangers were talking about taking away his sisters too. Mrs. Patterson, Margaret heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, could I speak with you privately for a moment? The social worker looked surprised but nodded. Margaret followed her into the hallway, her heart pounding with a decision she hadn't even realized she was making until the words came out of her mouth. I'd like to apply to foster all 3 children, Margaret said quietly. Mrs. Patterson blinked in surprise. Ms. Chen, I appreciate your concern for these children, but fostering is a significant commitment. You're a single woman with no experience raising children, and David's needs are particularly complex. The screening process alone takes months. I understand that, Margaret said, though she was making this up as she went along. But these children have been through enough trauma. Separating them now would cause more damage than any temporary inconvenience of placing them together. I'm afraid it's not that simple. There are regulations, background checks, home studies, training requirements. How long before David would have to be placed separately? Margaret interrupted. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. We can probably keep them together here for another week, maybe 2 at most. But the Hendersons are willing to take Emma and Mason immediately, and that kind of offer doesn't come along often. Then, give me those 2 weeks, Margaret said. Let me start the emergency fostering process. If something goes wrong or I can't meet the requirements, then we'll revisit other options. But give these children 2 more weeks together while we try. Through the window of the blue room, Margaret could see Emma holding David while Mason sat pressed against both of them, the 3 siblings forming a protective huddle against an uncertain world. The sight strengthened her resolve. I'll need to make some phone calls, Mrs. Patterson said finally. Emergency foster placements require approval from several departments. And, even if we fast-track your application, there are still home visits, references, background checks. I understand. Tell me what needs to be done, and I'll do it. Mrs. Patterson studied Margaret's face for a long moment. Can I ask what's changed? Yesterday you were a volunteer. Today you're willing to become a foster parent to 3 traumatized children. Margaret looked back through the window at the Jenkins siblings. Emma was whispering something to David, who was nodding seriously while still clutching Elliot. Mason had her hand on David's back, offering comfort in the instinctive way children did when they recognized pain in someone they loved. I lost my husband 3 years ago, Margaret said quietly. I thought that part of my life was over, the part where I could be important to someone, where someone could need me in a way that mattered. Yesterday, those children let me sit with them in their grief, and it reminded me that there are different ways to build a family, different ways to love people back to wholeness. Mrs. Patterson's professional expression softened slightly. Foster parenting is incredibly difficult, especially with siblings who have experienced this level of loss. Are you prepared for the challenges that might involve? Margaret thought about David's nightmares, Emma's fierce protectiveness masking her own fear, Mason's gentle spirit bruised by too much sadness too young. She thought about sleepless nights and therapy appointments and the slow, patient work of helping traumatized children learn to trust again. No, she said honestly. I'm not prepared. I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm scared I'll make mistakes. But I know that separating them right now would be another loss in lives that have already had too many losses. And I know that my house has been too quiet for too long. When they returned to the blue room, Emma immediately searched Margaret's face for news. What's happening? Are they taking us away today? Mrs. Patterson is going to explore some other options, Margaret said carefully, not wanting to raise hopes she couldn't guarantee. It's possible you might be able to stay together after all. Emma's eyes widened with desperate hope. Really? All three of us? We're working on it, Mrs. Patterson said diplomatically. Nothing is certain yet, but we're looking into emergency placement options that would keep you together. David looked up at Margaret then, his dark eyes seeming to search her face for something. She knelt down so she was at his eye level, speaking directly to him. David, whatever happens, people are going to keep working to make sure you and your sisters stay together. You're a family, and families belong together. David's grip on Elliot loosened slightly, and he reached out to touch Margaret's hand with one small finger. It was the tiniest gesture, but it felt like a question and a plea and a tentative offer of trust all wrapped into one. The rest of that day passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Margaret called her employer and explained she would need some time off to handle a family emergency, which was true in a way that surprised her with its accuracy. She contacted her bank to verify financial stability, called her doctor to request medical records, and began the process of transforming herself from a grieving widow who volunteered with children into a potential foster mother. Meanwhile, the Jenkins siblings seemed to sense that something important was happening. Emma asked careful questions about what kind of family might take all three of them together. Mason talked about what it would be like to live in a house again instead of the children's center. David remained quiet, but he stayed close to Margaret throughout the day, Elliot ever present in his arms. That evening, as Margaret prepared to leave for the day, Emma approached her with something like formality. Margaret? If we do get to stay together, if someone does want all three of us, what do you think they'll expect from us? The question was loaded with anxiety about being good enough, about being wanted, about not being too much trouble for whatever family might take them in. Margaret's heart ached for this young girl who was trying to make herself and her siblings acceptable to strangers. Oh, sweetheart, Margaret said, sitting down so she could look Emma in the eyes. The right family won't expect you to be anything other than exactly who you are. They'll expect you to be sad sometimes, because you've lost someone very important. They'll expect you to be scared sometimes, because your whole world has changed. They'll expect you to love your brother and sister fiercely, because that's who you are. What if we're too much trouble? What if David doesn't start talking again, or what if Mason has more nightmares, or what if I can't stop worrying about everything? Then, the right family will help you through the trouble and the nightmares and the worrying, Margaret said firmly. Because that's what families do. They don't love each other because it's easy. They love each other because they choose to, especially when it's hard. Emma's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back all day. I just want us to stay together. I don't care where we live or what we have to do. I just can't lose Mason and David too. Margaret pulled Emma into a hug, feeling the girl's thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. Over Emma's head, she could see Mason and David watching anxiously, and she opened her arms to include them too. For a moment, all four of them held each other in the fading afternoon light, and Margaret felt something click into place in her chest, a sense of rightness she hadn't felt since Robert died. You're not going to lose each other, Margaret whispered into Emma's hair. I promise you that. Whatever it takes, you three are staying together. As she drove home that night, Margaret called Sarah from her cell phone. How quickly can we move on the emergency foster placement paperwork? I've already started making calls, Sarah said. Mrs. Patterson was surprisingly supportive once you made your offer. I think seeing how the children respond to you made an impression. We can probably have a home visit scheduled for tomorrow afternoon if you're serious about this. I'm serious, Margaret said, and, as the words left her mouth, she realized they were truer than any words she had spoken in 3 years. What do I need to do to get ready? Make sure your house is safe for children, gather any documents about your finances and background, and be prepared for a lot of questions about your motivations and expectations. When Margaret reached her house, she stood in the doorway for a moment, seeing it with new eyes. The quiet rooms that had felt like a mausoleum suddenly looked like possibilities. The guest room that had been Robert's home office could easily become a bedroom. The dining room they never used could be a homework space. The backyard that had been empty could have a swing set and a garden where children could learn to grow things. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret went to sleep excited about the future instead of resigned to it. And, for the second night in a row, she dreamed about a small voice calling her name, though now she was beginning to suspect it wasn't a dream at all, but a premonition of something beautiful waiting to happen. Margaret Chen stood at her kitchen window, watching the autumn leaves fall into her empty backyard. 3 years had passed since Robert's funeral, and the silence in their house still felt like a weight pressing against her chest. She sipped her morning coffee from the mug that had once been his favorite, a small ritual that helped her feel less alone in the echoing rooms they had shared for 28 years. The phone rang, breaking through her quiet thoughts. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and saw the number for Riverside Children's Services, where she had been volunteering for the past 18 months. She had started helping there after Robert died, needing something to fill the endless hours and ease the ache of losing not just her husband, but their shared dream of having children together. "Hello, Margaret? This is Sarah from Riverside. I know it's your day off, but we have an emergency situation. Could you possibly come in today?" Sarah's voice carried the stress that Margaret had learned to recognize in the social worker's calls. Margaret set down her coffee mug and reached for her car keys before she even answered. "Of course. What's happened?" 3 siblings came in late last night. Their grandmother passed away suddenly, and she was their only remaining family. The oldest is 14, then there's an 11-year-old girl, and the youngest is just 6. They're scared, confused, and they won't talk to anyone. The little boy hasn't said a single word since they arrived. As Margaret drove through the familiar streets toward the children's center, she thought about the many children she had worked with over the months. Some were angry, some withdrawn, some desperate for attention. Each one carried their own story of loss and disappointment. She had learned to approach them gently, never pushing too hard, always letting them set the pace. The Riverside Children's Services building was a converted Victorian house that tried hard to feel warm and welcoming despite its institutional purpose. Margaret had spent countless hours in its playrooms and common areas, helping children with homework, reading stories, and simply listening when they needed someone to hear their fears and hopes. Sarah met her at the front door, relief evident on her tired face. "Thank goodness you're here. The Jenkins children are in the blue room. Emma, that's the 14-year-old, is trying to take care of the other 2, but she's overwhelmed. Mason, the 11-year-old girl, keeps crying for their grandmother. And little David." Sarah shook her head sadly. "He just sits there, staring at nothing. We can't get him to eat, drink, or speak." Margaret followed Sarah down the hallway, past familiar doors painted in cheerful colors that couldn't quite hide the sadness that lived in these rooms. Through the window of the blue room, she could see 3 children huddled together on a small couch. The oldest, Emma, had her arms protectively around her younger siblings. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and, even from a distance, Margaret could see the weight of responsibility pressing on her young shoulders. Mason, the middle child, was curled against Emma's side, her red-rimmed eyes staring at the floor. And David, the youngest, sat perfectly still at the end of the couch, his small hands folded in his lap, looking like he had retreated somewhere deep inside himself where the world couldn't hurt him anymore. Their grandmother raised them from the time David was a baby, Sarah explained quietly. She was 68 and had been struggling with her health, but the children didn't know how serious it was. She collapsed while making breakfast 3 days ago. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. A neighbor found the children still waiting for her to wake up. Margaret's heart clenched at the image. She had lost Robert suddenly, too, though she had been an adult with resources and support systems. These children had lost their whole world in an instant. "Have you found any other family members?" "We're still searching, but their grandmother's records show she was their only living relative. Their parents died in a car accident 6 years ago, when David was just a baby. Their grandmother, Helen Jenkins, took them in and raised them on her small pension. She never married, never had other children. As far as we can tell, these 3 are completely alone now." Margaret studied the children through the window. Emma was whispering something to Mason, stroking her hair with a tenderness that broke Margaret's heart. This girl was trying to be mother, father, and protector to her siblings while dealing with her own grief. David continued to sit motionless, as if any movement might shatter what little stability he had left. "What happens next?" Margaret asked. "We'll need to find them a foster home, hopefully together, though that's always challenging with 3 siblings. In the meantime, we're just trying to get them through each day. David especially concerns us. He hasn't spoken, hasn't eaten more than a few bites, and he barely sleeps. The trauma specialist thinks he's in shock." Margaret had worked with traumatized children before, but something about this little boy's stillness reached deep into her chest and squeezed. Maybe it was because she recognized that kind of silence, the way grief could make the world feel too loud and too bright and too overwhelming to navigate. "Would you mind if I spent some time with them? I don't have anywhere else to be today." Sarah's grateful smile was answer enough. "I was hoping you'd offer. You have a way with the quiet ones." Margaret knocked gently on the blue room door before entering. Emma's head snapped up immediately, her body tensing as if preparing to defend her siblings from yet another stranger who might separate them or deliver more bad news. "Hi," Margaret said softly, stopping just inside the doorway. "I'm Margaret. I volunteer here sometimes. I heard you 3 have had a really hard few days." Emma's eyes were sharp and distrustful, but she nodded slightly. "Are you here to take us somewhere else?" "No, honey. I'm just here to sit with you if that's okay. Sometimes it helps to have someone nearby who isn't asking questions or making decisions." Margaret moved slowly to a chair across from the couch, giving the children space while still being close enough to talk if they wanted to. She noticed David's eyes flicker toward her for just a moment before returning to his lap. "My name is Emma," the oldest girl said after a long pause. "This is my sister Mason, and that's David. He's our little brother." Her voice carried fierce protectiveness, as if saying their names was claiming them, keeping them together through the simple act of introduction. "It's nice to meet all of you. I'm sorry about your grandmother." Emma's composure wavered slightly. "Grammy was the best person in the whole world. She made us pancakes every Sunday morning, and she knew all our favorite songs, and she never got mad when we tracked mud in the house." The words came out in a rush, as if Emma needed to prove her grandmother's worth to this stranger. "She sounds wonderful," Margaret said gently. "It sounds like she loved you all very much." "She did." Mason spoke for the first time, her voice small and rough from crying. "She called me her sunshine because I have freckles. And she called Emma her little mother because she takes care of everyone. And David was her sweet boy because he always helped with the groceries even though the bags were too heavy for him." Margaret looked at David, who remained motionless except for the slight tightening of his hands. "It sounds like you were all very special to her." "We were supposed to take care of her," Emma said suddenly, her voice cracking. "She was getting tired more often, and sometimes she forgot things. I should have noticed she was sick. I should have called for help sooner." "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, leaning forward slightly. "What happened to your grandmother wasn't your fault. Sometimes people get sick in ways that nobody can see coming, no matter how much we love them or how carefully we watch." Emma's careful composure finally broke, and tears started streaming down her face. "But what's going to happen to us now? They keep saying they're looking for a family to take us all together, but what if they can't find one? What if we get separated?" The raw terror in Emma's voice made Margaret's throat tight. This child was carrying burdens no 14-year-old should have to bear, and the uncertainty of their future was adding unbearable weight to their grief. "The people here are going to work very hard to keep you together," Margaret said, wishing she could promise more than hope. "In the meantime, you're safe here, and there are people who care about what happens to you." Mason crawled closer to Emma, seeking comfort. "I miss Grammy so much. I keep forgetting she's not coming back, and then I remember and it hurts all over again." "That's normal," Margaret said softly. "Grief is like that. Your brain needs time to understand that someone so important is really gone. The forgetting and remembering will happen many times before it starts to hurt less." For the next hour, Margaret sat with the children as they shared memories of their grandmother. Emma told stories about Grammy teaching her to braid hair and helping with homework. Mason remembered baking cookies and watching old movies together. Even as they talked, David remained silent, but Margaret noticed he was listening, his head tilting slightly toward his sister's voices. When lunchtime arrived, Sarah appeared in the doorway. The other children had eaten and left the dining room, leaving just a few tables set for the Jenkins children. Emma and Mason picked at their sandwiches, but David sat in front of his untouched plate, staring at the food as if he couldn't remember what it was for. "David," Emma said gently, "you need to eat something. Grammy would want you to take care of yourself." David's shoulders trembled slightly, but he didn't reach for his sandwich. Margaret watched him struggle with something internal, some battle between his body's needs and his mind's refusal to accept this new reality. "Sometimes when we're very sad, our stomachs forget how to feel hungry," Margaret said quietly, addressing David directly even though he wasn't looking at her. "But our bodies still need food to keep going, even when we don't want to keep going." For a moment, David's eyes met hers, and Margaret saw depths of pain that no 6-year-old should carry. Then, he looked away again, but she had seen something flicker there, a recognition that someone understood his struggle. After lunch, they returned to the blue room, where the afternoon sun was streaming through the windows in golden bands. Mason curled up on the couch for a nap, exhausted by grief and uncertainty. Emma sat beside her sister, stroking her hair until Mason's breathing evened out in sleep. David remained in his spot at the end of the couch, but Margaret noticed he was watching her more openly now, as if trying to solve some puzzle about who she was and why she was still there. "David," Margaret said very softly, "would you like to come sit by the window with me? Sometimes looking outside helps when everything inside feels too heavy." To her surprise, David stood up slowly and walked to where she was sitting by the large window that overlooked the center's small garden. He didn't sit on the chair she had offered, but instead lowered himself to the floor beside her chair, leaning against it like a small, wounded animal seeking shelter. Margaret didn't try to make him talk or look at her. Instead, she pointed out the birds at the feeder outside, the way the wind moved through the oak tree, the squirrel that was busily burying acorns for winter. She spoke in a gentle, steady rhythm that seemed to calm something inside the little boy. After a while, David's head tilted back against her knee, a tiny gesture of trust that made Margaret's eyes burn with unshed tears. This child's pain was so enormous, and yet somehow he was still brave enough to reach for comfort from a stranger. "I used to have someone who died too," Margaret said very quietly, just for David to hear. "It was different because he was my husband, not my grandmother, but the missing him part feels the same. Like there's a hole where they used to be, and you're not sure how to walk around it without falling in." David's breathing changed slightly, becoming deeper, and Margaret realized he was really listening. She continued to speak in soft tones about loss and missing people and how sometimes the world felt too big and scary without the person who had been your safe place. As the afternoon wore on, other volunteers and staff members checked on them periodically, but Margaret stayed with the 3 children, creating a small bubble of stability in their chaotic world. She helped Mason with a puzzle when she woke from her nap, listened to Emma's worried questions about school and belongings and what would happen to their grandmother's house, and sat quietly with David as he processed his grief in silence. When evening came and it was time for Margaret to leave, Emma stood up abruptly. "Will you come back tomorrow?" The desperate hope in her voice caught Margaret off guard. In 18 months of volunteering, she had never had children attached to her so quickly or completely. Usually, it took weeks to build the kind of trust these 3 seemed willing to offer after just one day. "If you'd like me to, yes. I can come back tomorrow." Emma's relief was visible. "We don't know anyone else here yet, and you're..." She paused, searching for words. "You're not trying to fix everything. You're just here." Margaret understood. These children had been surrounded by well-meaning adults asking questions, making assessments, planning their futures. Sometimes what grieving people needed most was simply someone willing to sit in the sadness with them without trying to make it better. As Margaret gathered her purse and coat, David suddenly stood up from his spot by the window. He walked over to her, his small face serious and his dark eyes fixed on hers. For a moment, Margaret thought he might finally speak. Instead, David reached out and took her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers with surprising strength. He held her gaze for several heartbeats, and, in that silent exchange, Margaret felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just volunteering anymore. This was something deeper, something that was changing her as much as she hoped she was helping them. "I'll see you tomorrow, David," she whispered. He nodded once, a tiny gesture that felt enormous given his silence, and let go of her hand. As Margaret drove home through the darkening streets, she found herself thinking not about her empty house or her quiet evening routine, but about 3 children who had lost everything and were somehow still brave enough to trust a stranger. She thought about Emma's fierce protectiveness, Mason's gentle spirit, and David's profound silence that spoke louder than words. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret fell asleep that night thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday, planning how she could help these children navigate their grief instead of dwelling on her own. She didn't yet know that this was the beginning of something that would transform all their lives. She only knew that something about those 3 siblings had awakened a part of her heart she had thought was buried with Robert. In her dreams that night, Margaret heard a small voice calling her name, though she couldn't tell if it was memory or prophecy. Some miracles come wrapped in tragedy. Some families are born not from blood, but from broken hearts learning to beat again. This is the story of Margaret Chen, a 52-year-old widow who thought her days of motherhood were over, and 3 orphan siblings who had given up on finding a real home. It's about the day when a 6-year-old boy looked into her eyes and spoke a single word that would transform 5 lives forever. What started as a routine visit to help struggling children became something no one could have predicted. In a world where foster care often fails and adoption feels impossible, this is the true account of how the most unlikely family found each other in the darkest of times. It's a story that will make you believe in second chances, in the power of unexpected love, and in the beautiful truth that sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it. This is not just another heartwarming tale. This is the real story of Margaret Chan and the 3 children who called her name before they even knew her heart was big enough to hold them all.